Hello everyone and welcome to the RAF Museum's Research Lectures. I'm Dr. Harry Rafal and today we're going to host Brandon Lewis as he talks about Sir David Henderson, the forgotten father of the RAF. And before I introduce Brandon, it's a good opportunity for me to say, if you've been enjoying the lecture series, we'd really love to hear from you. If you haven't been enjoying the lecture series, I'd still like to hear from you. I probably won't love to hear from you, but I'd still like to, because one of the things we're looking to do is get feedback to see how they've been going. So if you've enjoyed them, if you are enjoying them, if you think there are things we could do better, bearing in mind it is a bit of a one-man band when I put these on, then do let us know in the comments section, either before, such as now, or afterwards. But yes, it'd be lovely to hear from you. Today we're joined from people around the world, which is a delight, but we've got some eminent guests as well. So I believe David Jordan's joining us. So hello, David. And yes, I'm going to introduce Brandon now, who's awarded a first-class degree from Northumbria University in Newcastle in 2020, before he undertook an MA at Northumbria in history, in which he achieved a commendation. Both his BA and MA dissertations focused on the history of the RAF in the early decades of the 20th century, and his original dissertation focused on the creation of the RAF, where he examined how the RAF came to being by tracking its history from 1911 to 1919. This work focused on David Henderson and how he helped create many of the ideas which would one day embody the RAF. His second dissertation focused on how the RAF was secured in a peacetime role and the imperial history of the RAF. Now, Brandon intends to pursue his interests in the history of the RAF further by undertaking a PhD, so it's great to be able to give him this platform and to see his research at this early stage, and we'll see, hopefully, how it progresses, Brandon, in a few years' time. So please do come back, assuming this all goes well. But yes, I'm delighted to introduce Brandon. So Brandon, take it away.
Hi everyone. This lecture has two main aims that are interlinked in a way that will be really impossible to talk about one without the other. Obviously, the first link is, as the title says, discussing how David Henderson should be regarded as the father of the Royal Air Force rather than Hugh Trenchard, who is the current prevailing figure in historiography. And even by the RAF, Hugh Trenchard, who would go on to become the first Chief of the Air Staff, is really known as a sort of affectionate title as the father of the RAF. This lecture, however, will be arguing that David Henderson should be regarded in this role and should be quite nicely given that title. To do this, I'll talk about how the RFC came into being, tracking its history from about 1908 to 1918 when the RAF finally was formed. Throughout the lecture, I'll also be looking at some other historical figures that are sort of passed over when talking about the father of the RAF. One of which being Frederick Sykes. Sykes was present from the start of the RFC and was the second Chief of Air Staff. He is quite often overlooked when talking about the early history of the RFC, despite his very important role in securing it. Before I start, though, and getting into the history of the Royal Flying Corps, I do want to give just some background on who Henderson is, because his early life and the role he would go on to play in the military are very important to how the RFC was established and how the RAF came into being. Henderson was born on August 1st, 1862, to quite a wealthy shipbuilding family in Scotland. He would go on to study for an engineering degree at the University of Glasgow before starting a career in the military. By 1883, he had passed out of the Military College Sandhurst as a lieutenant, but it would be during the Second Boer War that he would show what he was capable of. He arrived in Africa in 1899 as an intelligence officer and quickly make a name for himself with his impressive knowledge of reconnaissance. During the war, he would impress Lord Kitchener, and by 1901, he was appointed the Director of Military Intelligence. Quite an important part of Kitchener's staff. He was sort of in the inner circle with Kitchener, who even at this time was a very important man in the British military. He then came on to become one of the most well-regarded and respected intelligence officers in Britain, and by the end of the Boer War, his fortunes would rise by being awarded the Distinguished Service Order. After the Boer War, he would go on to publish two works on reconnaissance, Field Intelligence and Its Principles and Practice in 1904 and The Art of Reconnaissance in 1907. These works gained him much notoriety in the military, and he was thought of as one of Britain's leading experts on reconnaissance, an accolade that would be vital in creating the RFC. It was these works that Henderson started to argue that the future of reconnaissance would be revolutionized by new technologies, such as the motor car, which yet again was still quite a new invention, which would be used to support existing cavalry regiments. It is important that at this stage, Henderson was quite intelligent with how he worded his ideas about the future. He very much embedded it within the cavalry system itself, because even at this time, the cavalry regiments were still very highly thought of in Britain, and saying that these new technologies would completely replace them, even though that would go on to be the case, it wouldn't have garnered much support with the military to say that. So he was very clever with what he did with arguing for future technologies. There is a gap in the historical writing about Henderson, and it's a massive shame. He is one of the most influential figures of British military aviation, yet for the most part he's sort of relegated to a footnote in a Trenchard story, which is quite a sad thing. The RFC would be founded on April 13, 1912, and the Latin phrase "Pararuda ad astra" would be chosen by the motto by December 1912. Translated from Latin, it means "through adversity to the stars." It would have been impossible for the first pioneers of British military aviation to know how accurate this motto would become. The history of the RFC and later the RAFs were fought with difficulties, especially in its early years. Powerful military figures and political enemies would make it their goal to stop the creation of the RFC, yet it endured attempts by the traditionalists in the army and navy to stop it before it got off the ground. Throughout 1912 to 1914, two main military officers contributed to getting the RFC started: David Henderson and Frederick Sykes. It would be impossible to discuss this period without mentioning the work Sykes put into the RFC, as he, working with Henderson, would fight for its role. The history of British military aviation, however, starts sometime before the establishment of the RFC. History really begins in the spring of 1908 to 1909, when an ambitious politician set up a committee that would last until 1979. It's interesting to note that one of the first people who took military aviation seriously wasn't actually an officer in the army. It was a politician by the name of Richard Burden Haldon, who was the Secretary of State of War. He came to the realization that Britain was lagging far behind its continental neighbours in aerial matters, and he set out to create Britain's air service. It was on his advice to the Prime Minister at the time, Asquith, that the Advisory Committee for the Aeronautics was set up. The ACA was headed by some of the pioneers of aviation, such as John William Strutt, a renowned physicist, the Physics Nobel Prize winner, Howard Stoughton, a civil engineer, and representatives from the Army and Navy. All these figures were convinced by Haldon himself to join the actual committee. It's strange to say, but without Haldon, who was just a politician, it was arguable that British aeronautics would never have become sort of the scientific power it would one day become. And these committees of respected scientists would go on to report from essentially its creation in 1918. And some of these reports were supplemented by work that Henderson and Frederick Sykes were doing in the country. It was, however, Henderson was one of the first prominent British military officers to realise the usefulness of aircraft in war. By 1908, Henderson was becoming increasingly interested in aviation and would give his opinions to John French on the questions of aerial navigation. French would later use these opinions in a submission to a subcommittee, talking about Henderson's quite cautious but optimistic views for what the role of aviation could be in the British military. By 1909, Henderson had accompanied John French to France to discuss military aviation. At this point in time, France was the pioneer and arguably one of the leading countries in military aviation. During their stay, they discussed matters with some of the leading French experts, and these would arguably go on to shape some of Henderson and French's opinion on aviation. But even though Henderson had already started taking an interest in aviation during this period, it was really by chance that he got into flying itself. In 1911, during a stay at a Harrogate hotel, an aircraft performing in an air race landed in a field next to him. And Henderson reportedly had quite a lengthy conversation with the pilot, after which he concluded that he really needed to learn to fly. with his primary interest being in understanding how aeroplanes could be used for reconnaissance in a war. He realised quickly that a pilot would have unrestricted view of the entire area while flying, completely revolutionising the way reconnaissance information was gathered. He enrolled in a flying course at Brooklands, and through 1911 he learned to fly, devoting himself to the idea of aerial reconnaissance and flying service for the British military, and becoming one of the most influential men in forming the RFC. By February 27, 1912, he wrote a technical memorandum outlining the use of aircraft in war, concluding that the British military aviation would benefit from the use of aeroplanes for reconnaissance. Henderson argued that aircraft were far superior to horseback reconnaissance, as they could fly further, faster, and see more, concluding that aircraft could also map the terrain better than cavalry units could, and therefore be able to find the best locations for battles and ambushes. Throughout this period, Henderson became the public face for military aviation in Britain, and he played a substantial role in gaining favourable public opinion for aerial warfare, not least due to his efforts in France, where he sent back detailed reports on the French Air Force and provided aerial navigational aid to the French. Due to this, he was regarded as one of Britain's aerial experts when a committee into the RFC would later be set up. But it wasn't just Henderson's subcommittees and ideas that would go on to help form the RFC. He would also go on to use the press to great effect, and the case for military aviation. He would go on to court the press quite well in Britain and would help to ensure its survival. Funnily, this isn't the only time the RAF have used publicity and the press as a way to survive in turbulent times. They would later go on to use it after the war when the RAF was on shaky grounds. Officers in the RFC would spend talking in lecture power. Henderson would go on to talk in these, and Flag Zine, quite an influential paper, would pick up on many of these talks and report on exactly what they were saying and what the future of aviation in Britain was looking at. But other officers in the RFC, when it was initially set up, would go to schools and to discuss aviation with school children. And these efforts served two main purposes. It built up a further understanding of what the RAFC did in British culture, but it also helped continue the survival of the RFC in another way. These schoolboys would be the future recruits of the RFC. They would go on to fill the ranks of the RFC and later the RAF for many years, even if they were called up sooner than expected. Despite Henderson's best efforts, though, the British military aviation had to deal with high-ranking military opponents. William Nicholson, the Chief of the General Staff, had stated that flying was a useless and expensive fad, and Douglas Haig once told a friend to tell Sykes, who was also working on different reports, that he was wasting his time and flying can never be of use to the army. However, it's clear that not all army officers held this view. Brigadier General Henry Wilson, the Director of Military Operations in the War Office, did order Frederick Sykes to visit aerodromes in France and report on French air service. Sykes reported that aircraft could be used in a numerous way to help the war efforts, detailing 7 advantages and operations that aircraft can partake in. The first case is much like Henderson. He argued that reconnaissance would be a fantastic way that aircraft could be used. They could do in a matter of hours what the cavalry could only do in days. And he brought his attention to the use of French aircraft in Tripoli to reinforce his arguments. He argued that aircraft could make raids against key points such as bridges, junctions, railways, etc., arguing that aircraft could be used for tactical reconnaissance. In this role, aircraft could fly to great height to observe the ground, reporting to a commander the nature of ground around him, and allowing for an army to move efficiently throughout a country. Another role that he discussed would be to help direct military artillery fire and increase its accuracy and efficiency of the ground troops. Basically, officer in an aircraft would be able to see exactly where the shells are landing and be able to report back whether or not they were landing too far away from the enemy, whether they were too short, and whether or not they had to aim in slightly better. And another use one of the final uses that he came up with was that aircraft could be used instead of telephones and telegraphs for the army steering communication. During war, if these went down, massive armies would lose contact with each other, and aircraft could bridge that gap if communications were lost. By 1911, Prime Minister Henry Asquith, on the recommendation of John Seeley, who was a member of the Imperial Defence, began the creation of a subcommittee to research the use of aerial warfare. Some MPs at this time had started taking the advice of Henderson, Sykes, and Haldon that Britain wasn't just lacking in air force or any aerial matters, it was non-existent. The size of French and German air squadrons increased massively during this period, and politicians began to panic. Addressing the Lord, Charles York, the 8th Earl of Hardwicke, reported that France had between 200 to 300 warplanes, while also reporting that Britain only had 6 trained aviators and 2 planes to its name. Not entirely true. Civil aviation did have more trained aviators than that. But the idea that France had this massive build-up of aircraft, even if it was slightly exaggerated, panicked people in Britain. Obviously, France, although would go on to be an ally and was an ally during this time, was an historic enemy of Great Britain. But it still took 2 years for the government to listen to some of the most influential politicians and military minds of the 20th century. But nevertheless, the committee was set up, and it included some of the most powerful figures of the 20th century, names that most people will recognise. Winston Churchill represented the Admiralty, Seeley and Henderson represented the Army, and who they would strongly put forward the case for the Royal Flying Corps. The report, which was mostly written on the advice of Henderson, Seeley and Sykes, recommended that a new aeronautical service be set up called the Royal Flying Corps, consisting of a naval wing, a military wing, and a central flying school. Furthermore, on the recommendation of Henderson, a purely advisory board titled the Air Committee was to be created as a permanent subcommittee in the Committee of Imperial Defence. All these recommendations were accepted on April 13, 1912, and the RAFC was awarded the Royal Roan by the King. It is important to note at this point that the Royal Flying Corps was not a separate branch of the military, although it was part of the army and did have its own structure and leaders. It was firmly part of the army. It wouldn't be until 1918 that Britain would have its independent air force. Sykes was chosen to command the military wing, while Henderson became the Director General of Aeronautics, which gave him a lot of power over policy, and allowing him the unique ability to argue politically for the Royal Flying Corps, which he would do throughout this period in the First World War. It was in 1912 that Trenchard first joined the RSC and learned to fly, taking a position second in command of the flying school. He wasn't influential yet, but he would go on to become quite an influential figure. Henderson was held in high regard with the aerial community and did much to further the cause of the RFC, as he was often considered the face of British aerial warfare. In an issue of the, yet again, influential Flight magazine, he was even proclaimed as one of the men of the moment in the world of flight. And the prevailing view at the time with the RFC's one rule should be reconnaissance. This was argued by the leaders of the army and even Henderson. Henderson, as a pilot and reconnaissance expert, could articulate how useful aircraft could be in spotting enemies in ideal battlegrounds. He could link reconnaissance to cavalry, which was an existing part of the army, and he could compare the benefits of aviation over horses. This was done to allow non-experts to have some understanding about the usefulness of aircraft in war. In 1913, a year before the war, Sykes would report that eventually I assume the duties of the wing will be home defence. At present, however, its functions are limited to the provision of an air service for the expeditionary force. It's imprudent, therefore, to design its war and peace organisation mainly with the ideas of these functions. What Sykes is talking about is keeping the RFC as a purely reconnaissance unit. The RFC was designed in that role. It was designed by Henderson around reconnaissance. It was the role that the army wanted to do, and it was what the War Office agreed. The RFC at this point in time was designed and defined purely as a support role. And arguably, this is one of the reasons that it was allowed to survive. That Henderson's and Sykes' focus on reconnaissance it gave it the ability to not take too much of the glory from the infantry. At this point, aviation was still new. No one really understood how it was going to be of use. These great dogfights in the sky, which would mark the 20th century, were unthinkable and a far-off dream in 1911. No aircraft had successfully been built really at this period with fighting in mind. So the ability of Henderson to link this new form of military warfare to an existing one to demonstrate its usefulness arguably saved the RFC. Both Henderson and Sykes remained confident that soon the aircraft would exist that would take part in great battles of the sky, but for now, reconnaissance was its only accepted use. But he felt that he already felt uncomfortable with the RFC taking over the role of the cavalry. Military leaders in the area had already begun to complain to Henderson and to other RFC officers that aircraft simply could not be used for reconnaissance as it would frighten the horses. It was a safe course of action, therefore, not to ask for too much too soon, as all that would have been achieved would have been more open hostility than the RFC already faced. However, even in this early stage, Henderson was keen to expand the role of the RFC, and in July 1912, he gave a lecture to the Aeronautical Society and military leaders, which was reported in the Aeronautical Journal. In this lecture, he yet again recounted how aircraft could be used for reconnaissance, since this was the only role military commanders found acceptable for the RFC. However, Henderson would also use his lecture to outline the future ideas of policy, and listening to some of Henderson's ideas is sort of what the RAF still do to this day. He argued that much like cavalry, yet again he used the cavalry as a basis to argue that cavalry in warfare was often seen as the best counter to cavalry. Therefore, he argued that aircraft will one day be the best counter to aircraft. So one day armed aircraft would be developed that would fight for air superiority. In the General Staff Conference of January 1913, Henderson would argue that the effect aircraft could have on morale was substantial. He would go on to state that there is no doubt that any superiority we may get from fighting in the air will act as a strong moral deterrent to the enemy. Henderson clearly showed he understood the future of air power and how vital it was going to be, arguably one of the first British officers who saw the potential moral devastation aircraft could inflict on ground troops and the will of the enemy to continue to resist. At this point in 1913, bombs dropped from aircraft was an outlier. It wasn't something that was widely done. It wasn't something that was widely accepted. So at this point, him understanding that will one day go on to play quite a moral devastation against an enemy force it shows just how ahead of his time he actually was. And yet again, he was one of the first military officers who would argue that air superiority would be vital to area matters. To this day, air superiority is one of the guiding principles of warfare, that essentially no military operation can go ahead without having complete control of the air. Despite Henderson's views, some British commanders were not convinced. John Philip Duquesne, a leading British general, would state that aircraft were admirable aids to reconnaissance, but the belief in fighter aircraft seemed to require the imagination of a writer of fiction. And this does demonstrate that Henderson's policy to focus solely on reconnaissance was the right course of action during this period. As any attempt to expand the role, even if it was just in theory, which is what Henderson was talking about at these talks, was met with sharp backlash from some of the military elite. By early 1914, the government believed war with Germany was imminent. They believed it before then, but by 1914, it was very clear that war was going to break out, meaning the RFC was required to build up its forces to challenge Germany. This did prove problematic for the new force, as reports in 1914 found that at best the Royal Aircraft Company, one of the sole providers of aircraft, could only produce about 2 aircraft a month. This still demonstrates how decisive the RAFC was. The Royals weren't really interested in building up the RFC, and as such, it only had about 63 aircraft by the start of the war, in comparison to France, which had 120, and Germany possessed about 232. Still, at this period of time, the naval arms race was going on, and that was clearly where the money was going, was towards the Navy and towards building more dreadnoughts. The lack of attention given to military aviation meant that Britain also had quite a large gap in technology. It simply couldn't close in time. The pilots themselves realised that aircraft they were flying were not really suitable for the job. Philip Joubert, a pilot of the time, recorded, "We had plenty of energy and confidence, but the equipment was woefully bad." And that is a sentiment that would have been echoed across the entire RFC. The pilots and crew were ready, but the equipment fell far short of expectations. The RFC wasn't just outnumbered in 1914, it was even outclassed in terms of equipment. The situation became worse just before the outbreak of the First World War. The Navy resented aerial matters being under the control of the Army, leading them splitting away from the wing in 1914, making a naval wing of its own, the Royal Naval Air Service. This formally split Britain's air defence in two and ruined the idea of just one cohesive force that would just deal with all aerial matters. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that the competition between the two rival air services would be vital in one day creating the RAF. British aerial defence during this time had been reviewed multiple times throughout 1913 and 1914, and it came to the same conclusion that Britain was vulnerable. The War Office and the Admiralty needed to work together to organise the defence of Great Britain. However, since the RFC and the Royal Naval Air Service split, neither could agree on whose job it was to defend Britain, and both claimed it was their responsibility. And Churchill even commented on this in October 1914, thereby stating that right up until a month before the war, the aerial defence of Britain was solely the responsibility of the War Office and not the Admiralty. Worse still, the War Office reportedly provided no aircraft for the defence of Britain, and by this point the RNS had 50 aircraft of its own that it wanted to use to defend Britain, a role that it had asked for since its creation. Churchill's worry about the RFC not providing adequate defence for the country does prove true. However, when war broke out, the RFC flew essentially every aircraft and pilot they had to France, leaving Britain completely defenceless. The RNS would then be given the role of defending Britain. So by the start of the war in August 1914, the command structure of the RFC was formally split, the aircraft being used were outdated, underperforming, and not designed to fight at all. And every single RFC aircraft was in France without the ability to guard Britain. It's therefore that when the Royal Flying Corps was sent to France with the rest of the British Expeditionary Force, it was sent with little more than a hope and a prayer. They were sent to war with underperforming aircraft, under-trained pilots, and ground crews who were still very novel to the concept of military warfare, as well as being commanded by leaders who had a distinct distrust for each other. The stage was set for a military disaster, yet the RFC proved itself to be a military success and a necessity to the war effort. From the start of the war, reconnaissance by the RFC proved it could assist the army in manoeuvring, informing on weak enemy positions, and helping the army avoid ambushes. Over the next 4 years, the commanding officers would revolutionise the way the war in the air was fought. New requirements had to be met as control of the sky and aerial superiority for aircraft would be vital for strategic bombing and destroying fortifications and trenches and several other jobs. In these 4 long years, the RFC would be transformed into the most modern air force at the time. By July 1914, the RFC was preparing for war, and as such, command of the RFC in the field was given to Henderson and Sykes, his chief of staff. Trenchard then took over from Sykes as commander of the military wing at Farnborough, remaining in Britain. On August 4, 1914, Britain formally declared war on Germany, and by August 13, the entire RFC, numbering some 63 aircraft, were assembled at Dover Airfield so they could fly to France together. Despite the poor equipment and training of the Air Force, the young aviators were prepared to do their duty. Yet the lack of preparation was hardly the most fatal problem at the time. Complicating the conditions of the RFC further was the shocking fact that 3 men in charge of it distrusted each other. Among the 3 men, none hated each other quite as much as Sykes and Trenchard. Sykes viewed Trenchard as a rival who had a loud voice, seemed to betray a permanently vacant mind, and Trenchard was of the opinion that Sykes was the most conceited and indecisive officer. While Sykes and Trenchard hated each other, it seems Henderson held little animosity between Trenchard and Sykes. And some historians do disagree on this. Some state that even at this early period, he distrusted Sykes and didn't really like the man, while other historians argue that it wasn't until later on that the distrust between Henderson and Sykes would flare. It would be a legitimate concern if he didn't like Sykes, because Sykes years later did publish a book from many angles in which he states in 1912 he was on 2 occasions promised command of the RFC if war broke out, and when war did break out, he wasn't given command. So by the outbreak of the war, the 3 main commanders, the leaders of the RFC, did not trust each other. This mistrust would go on to play a vital role in how the RFC was used throughout the war and eventually in the development of the RAF. Throughout the early months of the war, the RFC was expected to do the only tasks it had been trained for: reconnaissance of enemy positions and artillery spotting. Early aerial warfare was confined to this role, and the great battles in the sky that Henderson and Sykes envisioned seemed a long way from reality. The main problem at this point was Henderson and Sykes did not design the RFC to be an offensive unit. Despite this, spotting and communication with ground proved to be a vital tool. Using a Sterling Spark transmitter, a navigator or pilot could send back the location of artillery in Morse code and communicate with British artillery when best to fire and help correct them if they needed it. The focus on reconnaissance did not mean that flying was a safe role during this period. During the Battle of Ypres alone, the RFC lost 40 of the 63 aircraft it flew to France, an unmitigated disaster for the fledgling RFC. That meant reconnaissance missions had to be sent up far more sparingly than Henderson would have liked. However, this great loss did achieve one thing. It enamoured the RFC with the Army High Command. In a letter back from the front, John French, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, commented on the battle and the work done by the RFC, stating that their skill, energy, and perseverance had been beyond all praise. They had furnished me with the most complete and accurate information, which would have been of incalculable value in the conduct of operations. Later, he even noted that RFC pilots had shot down 5 enemy machines, which is making it one of the first instances of British aerial fighting. Henderson's vision of the RFC and the dedication he and his pilots had put into the work was making the commanders of the army finally see aerial warfare as a necessity to war. Henderson, while on leave in Britain, visited Trenchard, and during a conversation, the two reportedly came to a friendly argument about Henderson's leadership style. Trenchard was under the opinion that the RFC wasn't being aggressive enough despite the losses, reportedly claiming that pilots were wrapped in cotton wool. He argued that RFC should be made into a more offensive unit with aggressive tactics to gain air superiority and assist the army. Trenchard, during this period, would repeatedly state that RFC should be brought under the full command of the Army High Command structure instead of being the semi-independent state it was in. It was during this period that Henderson first started to form ideas of an independent air force that had a separate role away from the army. But yet the war was on, so any look into what an independent air force would look like sort of on the back burner to just trying to survive. Trenchard cared little for Henderson's ideas of an independent air force and still believed that the army should be on full command of aerial matters. But it would be during this conversation that Trenchard would be promoted to lead the newly formed First Wing in France. This finally placed him in the front lines where he wanted to be and allowed him to start influencing policy. Air dogfights during this early part of the war did occur, but they were done with rifles and pistols fired by pilots, and they were woefully inaccurate. Pilots did also carry small bombs and grenades, which in theory they could drop on enemy aircraft and ground troops, but this also proved to be useless. They weren't very accurate. So during the Battle of Aubers Ridge, Trenchard and the First Wing would be tasked with deterring enemy reconnaissance before switching to a bombing role. And Trenchard revelled in this as he believed it was his opportunity to show how his vision for air power, a far more aggressive role, would be superior to Henderson's. But it proved futile and did little to change the actual battle, which the British and the French forces lost. In a diary entry from May 10, 1915, Trenchard noted that he began to doubt the usefulness of air power and his vision of it, while Henderson, on the other hand, was one of the first to realise that he and Sykes and the War Office had made a mistake focusing on reconnaissance. As early as September of 1914, he wrote requesting more aircraft be designed and built that could carry machine guns. But despite this request, Henderson's make-do version of air-to-air fighting would carry on throughout the early months of 1915. It was during this period that the RFC would experiment with rudimentary bombing runs. Its role was finally being slowly expanded. Many pilots used homemade equipment such as petrol bombs, grenades to cause damage to train lines, communication lines, or even marching columns of men if they so happened to pass them. But it proved difficult and many missed their targets. The only real damage was done to morale. General Erich Ludendorff, one of the foremost members of the German general staff, would later write in his biography about the damaging effects the RFC had on the German trenches, stating the whole morale of the men would damage as some were often wounded. By 1915, Henderson had successfully expanded the operation of the RFC and commanded pilots to partake in tactical bombings, with one of the most successful being the raid on the Rubino and Courtrai railway stations. Both raids would stop supplies getting to the German army and arguably force the Germans to delay an offensive. It is clear that during this period, Henderson was keen to expand the limited role of the RFC in any way possible to make it a more needed organisation, and he began to take the tentative steps towards the idea of an independent air force. But by the summer of 1915, Henderson was an ill man, and he couldn't really command the force in the field as much anymore. He was sent back to Britain and would spend the rest of the war in Britain, continuing fighting for supplies and pilots. Henderson had left the RFC in France in a far stronger position than it was in a year earlier, and now had an expanded role and had proved its worth to the Army High Command. Henderson would continue to serve as the Director-General of Military Aeronautics throughout the war. However, his role in development of tactics would arguably be second to Trenchard, who took over from Henderson in the field. There was a prominent gap, and many people would have thought that Sykes would be the natural fit for it. He was, after all, Henderson's deputy during this time period. But Sykes had been sent to the RNAS to support the Admiralty in the Mediterranean campaign. So he was passed over for the control of the RFC in France, and Trenchard got it. Trenchard promptly went about reorganising the mission of the RFC under two guiding principles that would remain essentially unchanged throughout the war. First was that if the army requested the aircraft, they would fly no matter what, boasting no call from the army must ever go unanswered. One can simply view this as Trenchard realising the RFC could shorten the war and help save British lives. However, it is also probable that Trenchard knew the survival of military aviation was based on how useful it was in the war effort, and showing bravery despite the odds would go on to endear the public and the government to the RFC, making its survival far more likely. Secondly, he argued that air superiority was essential for victory in the air. In this role, he would demand more fighter-capable aircraft to be manufactured, and Henderson would go about ensuring that these would make it to the front lines. His focus on air superiority was due to the belief that it was the only way air power could effectively be used. That if aircraft from the Germans couldn't be sent up without meeting fighter aircraft, and their role would be essentially ruined. And British aircraft would have to be unhindered by the enemy during their mission, so Britain needed control of the skies. And Trenchard during this period would go on to build what many today would consider the modern Air Force, expanding not only the role of the RFC physically, but also the RFC's role. From 1916 onwards, documents would be written up to describe the future air policy in Britain. It had been seen through these documents that Trenchard had a great understanding of how useful the RFC could be in war. The open memorandum by Trenchard on the future of air power, drafted in September of 1916, states that an aircraft is an offensive, not defensive weapon, and that the best policy guide to British aerial warfare is a relentless and relentless offensive. Trenchard was not alone in this belief, as that is from 1915 shows. It was Henderson also by this point agreed that the use of fighter aircraft was vital. Clearly, Henderson's early views of offensive policy had influenced Trenchard to some degree, and his policies by 1916. Throughout 1916 and 17, the RFC would devote more and more attention to tactical bombing coupled with air superiority missions so aircraft could fly unhindered. A document produced in the spring of 1916 described the 5 rules of the RFC as combat patrols, reconnaissance, artillery spotting, tactical bombing, and long-range offensive bombings, which had finally become a feasible action due to technological advancements. Listing those 5 things off, that's still what the RAF do to this day. The RAF still fly reconnaissance missions. They're still a tactical bombing force, and they're still a long-range offensive bombing force. To keep up with these new rules, the RFC went through a rapid growth during this period. It was during this period that the RFC had semi-control of the skies of France, and it was basically unthinkable for an army to move without air support. Combat patrols of the Western Front became part of daily life for many pilots, and fighting in the sky became just as deadly as the fighting on the ground. Despite the period known as the Fokker Scourge during the 1915 and early 1916, and periods which was dominated by the German air forces, as their aircraft simply had superior firepower and more flexible tactics. The RFC would effectively gain air superiority by June 1916. German soldiers often reported looking up and seeing only RFC aircraft in the sky. Trenchard's policy of offensive flying, no matter what, held out due no small part of the tremendous effort by Henderson to make sure supplies and new pilots constantly reached the RFC fighting at the front. Trenchard had taken the ideas and the groundwork laid out by Henderson and forged a truly modern air force by 1916, whose role was now firmly established. So it was over the skies of France that the British Air Force was essentially secured. But by 1917, 1918, an independent Air Force was needed. It was being argued for since essentially the creation of the RFC, but due to the war, it wasn't really feasible. But at this point, the RFC and the RNS for years had supply problems. Both argued that they weren't getting enough aircraft or pilots, and both argued that their needs were far more greater than the next. Henderson at this point had seen the usefulness of bombing raids in Germany, and he knew that part of aerial warfare was not getting the attention it needed because it was outside of the army's purview. At this point, raids into German cities were still rare, but they were done, and what these accomplished was a moral panic on the German front, in the German civilian front, which helped bring about an end of the war because no one wants to be bombed, and it helped destroy industry. So German weaponry wasn't going to be reaching the front as efficiently as it would have if it was unmolested by the RAF, by the Royal Flying Corps. An independent air force in 1917 was not just looking likely, it was desperately needed. And it would be during this period that Henderson would go on to forge the documents that created the RFC. Much like the creation of the Royal Flying Corps, however, it would not be without its difficulties and enemies. The Admiralty would fight back essentially every step of the way against its creation and spend the first few years of the RAF's life desperately trying to end it and reabsorb the Royal Naval Air Service. Many historians and even the RAF see the two Smuts reports as Keystone foundations, as the Keystone Foundation of the RAF, and the RAF Museum does have it fully online. These documents detail why the RAF was needed and what the role of the RAF could be. Jan Smuts, a member of the Imperial War Cabinet, was a man tasked with producing these reports on the nature of the British Air Service after the previously mentioned Gotha raids, which had began to attack London during this period. The Gotha raids were incredibly successful. The Royal Naval Air Service couldn't really get up to fight them, and when they did see them, they didn't shoot them down. It caused panic amongst the British public and began talks of why the aerial matters of Britain was split and why they weren't being effective. Despite Jan Smuts' name being on these papers, however, he held little actual knowledge about air power, and therefore the reports would be largely written by his second-in-command, David Henderson. Henderson would not get the credit for these reports, but his influence on these documents are undoubtable. The first document, which was circulated in the July of 1917, concerned a more effective defence of London and suggested a single centralised air defence system, bringing together observation, anti-aircraft artillery, communications and aeroplanes under one command. However, this document did not have much of an effect, as the second report, which was circulated in the August of 1917, this document called for two major changes. The first was an air ministry that would have similar powers and prestige as the War Office and Admiralty, and this was done to make sure that aerial matters were taken in the same confidence as the Army and Navy were, and that the organisation would have a dedicated system fighting for it. And the second, and by the far most contested, recommendation was for a single, unified, independent air service, completely away from both the Army and the Royal Navy. This was almost entirely credited to Henderson, who had argued for an independent air service for a while now. The proposal rested solely on the ability of Britain to bomb German factories, as the report concluded that continuous and intense pressure against the chief industrial centres of the enemy, as well as on the lines of communication, may form the determining factors in bringing about peace. Henderson now finally received the support he needed to argue for an independent air service. And ironically, it wasn't any of Trenchard's successes or the RFC being amazing in France that had secured this. It was Trenchard's failure to focus on long-range bombing during the war rather than his successes that had made the independent Air Force a reality. The second Smuts report was acted on almost immediately. By August 24th, 1917, the War Cabinet met to decide whether to accept it. Winston Churchill was the most supportive, along with Lord Curzon. However, just like the creation of the Royal Flying Corps, there was strong opposition from the Admiralty. The First Lord of the Admiralty strongly disagreed and argued against the creation of the Air Ministry and Unified Air Force, citing the fact that the Royal Navy had vastly different aims to the Army and therefore was not beneficial to them. The War Office also tried to amend the report and requested that the Army held the right to determine its own aerial matters, but this amendment would be quashed. Yet again, the Army and the Navy were desperate to avoid Britain having an air force, but this time it was because they both realised how vital air power was to the war effort, and they both wanted to retain control, unlike in the creation of the Royal Flying Corps, where both didn't understand how vital aviation would be. Both the Admiralty and the War Office were overruled, and the rest of the War Cabinet and the recommendation laid out in Smuts' report was accepted. By November 29, 1917, the Air Force Constitution Act was passed, in which the RAF was finally determined to exist. Even in these documents, it was still just called the Air Force at this point. It hadn't been given its name. In late November, the Air Council was set up under Harold Hamsworth, the Lord Rothermere, who had an interest in aviation and aerial matters. And in January 1918, Henderson would accept the role of Vice President. The independent Air Force that Henderson had wanted for all these years was now secured in law, and it now had direct influence over its formation as the Vice President of the Air Council. This new force would be scheduled to be formed on April 1st, 1918, rather ironically, April Fool's Day. Trenchard, despite the title later attributed to him, was initially the greatest opponent against the formation of the RAF within the Royal Flying Corps. By late 1917, he had forged the RFC into an organisation that could retain air superiority, and his views stayed the same as the ones in 1915. The sole purpose of aviation was to assist the army, and therefore an independent air service was not in the army's best interests. In August 1917, upon receiving the final draft of the Smuts report, he detailed his own memorandum entitled Reasons Against Creating a Separate Air Service. In this report, Trenchard made clear that he believed a new service would severely damage the efficiency of the war in the air that he'd spent years building, further arguing that long-range bombing missions were not as important as helping the soldiers on the front line. In October, he would argue in reports that the union of the RFC and the RNAS would lead to friction and serious danger of loss of efficiency. This is the most damaging evidence against the commonly held belief that Trenchard was the father of the Royal Air Force. He never wanted it to be formed and would go on to put the entire organisation at risk, nearly ending it just as it began. Despite this, the Air Force needed a leader, and the seemingly obvious choice, Henderson, was passed up. Trenchard was the next choice, and despite his opposition to the air service, he would be the man who would be offered the role of the Chief of Air Staff, a role he accepted reluctantly on July 3rd, 1918, after hours of debate with Rothermere. The new role was meant to make the creation of the Air Force easier, so that there would be a designated leader when the Air Force was finally formed. A close friend of Trenchard, John Salmond, took over from him as head of the RFC in France while the RAF was still being formed. The stage was now set for the creation of the RAF. The organisation did need a name, though, and in all documents it had simply been known as the Air Force. But the Air Council wanted to reflect a slightly more prestigious image, and therefore wanted it to be called the Royal Air Force, in the same way the Royal Navy was named. On February 19, 1918, the Air Council was informed that the King was more than happy to consent to the name Royal Air Force. On March 22nd, 1918, the King signed the Royal Warrant ordering for the merger of the RFC and the RNAS, and 10 days later, on April 19, 1918, the RAF was born. There was no fanfare or great parade to mark the creation of the revolutionary and the first of its kind independent Air Force. Instead, all that really changed was the stamp on the top of documents now read RAF instead of RFC. On the Western Front, the RAF barely noticed the change. Pilots and commanders still operated much the same way doing the jobs before the merge. RNS pilots' machines still did not find their way to France, and many RNS pilots still struggled to find something to do. Trenchard built the RF policy the same way we built the RFC policy. The mission of the RAF at this point was air superiority. A pamphlet published in March 1918 stated the same thing it did in 1917. The primary task of the RAF must be to gain and maintain superiority in the air, as without such superiority, the effective cooperation of aircraft with the other arms is hindered. Trenchard was still under the impression that the RAF's only job was to assist the army rather than carry out missions. The first months of the RAF were not free from turmoil. Since taking the post of the Chief of Air Staff, Trenchard had lamented his decision. On February 10, 1918, he wrote to his close friend, John Salmond, informing that the entire ministry was ridiculous and inefficient. 3 days later, he wrote a separate letter where he stated his deep regret that the government took the deplorable decision to create an independent air force. He was also directly annoyed at the lack of control he had over the new force and believed his authority was constantly being undermined by the Air Council and that decisions were being made without him. On March 22, these issues became too much for him, and he announced his plan to resign Chief of the Air Staff, plunging the future of the RAF into chaos. Rothermere managed to convince Trenchard to stay on until the official formation of the RAF on April 1st to stop panic from gripping. From the start, Trenchard had claimed that he would not suit life behind the desk, and that claim proved to be far too true. Trenchard's resignation would be accepted on April 10, and he achieved little in his time as leader of the RAF, except to follow what the RFC and RANS had already been doing. Sykes would go on to take over from Trenchard, but his early leadership was marred by a series of high-profile resignations. The most damaging was Henderson, who finally retired from aerial matters and his position as vice president of the Air Council. In a letter to Rothermere, he stated that his reason for leaving was to get away from the intrigue of the Air Ministry. Later, he would make it known that he could not work under Sykes. However, this is debated by historians. It's in his wife's diaries rather than anything that he said rather than anything he wrote or said to anyone. The resignation marked the end of Henderson's vital work for British aerial warfare, and shortly afterwards, Rothermere would also resign, claiming ill health. These 2 major resignations threw the fate of the RAF into question once more, as politicians of the public began to wonder why the ministry was not working. Sykes, however, would go on to lay much of the groundwork for what the RAF would become. He started the first bombing runs into the mainland Germany against industry and towns, which was something that was recommended in the Smuts report. It was hardly Sykes' idea, but he was vital in making sure that it went ahead. And he continued a lot of the work that Trenchard had set up, and would eventually give command of what would be called an independent air service, which would be led by Trenchard, which focused entirely on bombing raids. During the war, publicity put a lot more in these bombing raids than there was actually there. The RAF dropped some 537 tons of munitions in total, and 220 tons on railways. Surveys conducted after the war found most of the bombs dropped by the Independent Air Force missed their target, and those that did hit caused minor damage. But it did achieve another goal, which was unsettling the enemy. Reports after the war found that many German citizens panicked during the raids, and after they were worried that aircraft might come back, leading to a significant drop in support for the war. Trenchard was proven right, as the use of long-range bombing, while unsuccessful at destroying industry, was extremely successful at demoralising the enemy. Despite this, the Independent Air Force did not achieve any great military victory. However, in the final months of the war, the RAF was involved in close combat and strategic bombing that undoubtedly hurried the end of the war, as the RAF would bomb columns of men, destroy enemy equipment and supplies. A report of the RAF's usefulness in 1918 claimed that the RAF destroyed 12,000 enemy artillery, 1,150 gun pits, and some 256 photos had been taken in support of troop movement. This demonstrates the scale of the RAF's work to support ground troops. By the end of the war on November 11, 1918, the RAF had established itself in its new role, defined by the RFC and the new policy Sykes has introduced, such as British home defence and long-range bombing. The RAF would be scaled back after the war. It couldn't get the budget that it needed, and that its future was thrown into question on multiple occasions. But that is for a different lecture. Just to quickly conclude, Henderson was one of the first pioneers of British aerial warfare, even before the official founding of the Royal Flying Corps. He was working to make aerial warfare matters more accepted in the British military. He developed his thoughts within technical memorandums that outlined just how useful air reconnaissance could be. Owing to his outstanding military record, he was able to convince a subcommittee to vote for the foundation of the Royal Flying Corps, essentially writing the reports himself. In those early years of the RFC, he, along with Sykes, developed the policies that would be later used in the First World War. While limited to reconnaissance, he was able to prove that aerial matters could be useful to a modern military, and did much to convince military commanders and the politicians of his points. He was able to talk about aerial matters in a way at which non-experts could gain an understanding. Linking aerial matters to cavalry was an incredibly intelligent way to make it seem more accepted. He led the RFC during a time of war, and would slowly expand the role it was given. By 1915, he'd left the RFC in a far better position than it was when he came to power. He realised that air superiority would needed to be won, and would lay the groundwork for Trenchard to expand the RFC further during the war. When it came to the formation of the RAF, Henderson stands out as the advocate above all others. He faced considerable opposition during the war when he first argued for an independent air force. And he essentially wrote the two Smuts reports, laying the foundation documents of the RAF, arguing that British air defence and long-range bombing facilitated a new and independent organisation away from the control of the Navy and Army. He went on to argue that the RAF had managed to convince the War Cabinet and of the Independent Air Force as the only solution to the problems plaguing British aerial matters. Trenchard was vital in its later years, and he would go on to secure the RAF. And the work he did in securing the RAF shouldn't be forgotten. Yet again, for another lecture. But when it came to establishing the RAF in the first place, Trenchard was one of the greatest opponents against it. He argued that it was a horrible decision. He argued that it would be inefficient, and that he lamented the despicable decision that the government had taken. Along with his sudden abandonment of the RAF just as it was getting off the ground. These are perhaps the most damaging evidence to the prevailing belief that he was the father of the RAF. Trenchard's work shouldn't be overlooked just because of that. However, he did help create a Royal Flying Corps, and he did help build a lot of what the modern British RAF would go on to do. But even he argues that he shouldn't be retitled the father of the RAF. In his own biography, he said that accolade should go to David Henderson. Even Trenchard was aware that the role David Henderson played in forming the RAF far surpassed his. And it is why, in my opinion, for all the reasons I've mentioned today, that David Henderson should not just be regarded as the true father of the Royal Air Force, but as one of the founding fathers of British military aviation. And thank you for listening.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Brandon. Always an enjoyable topic to hear research on. So very pleased to have had you on. We have had a question in, which I'm going to take in a moment, but just to encourage our audience, if they want to put a question to you, they can do so using the Ask a Question function. I have some questions for you as well, don't worry. But this one comes... This one comes from Morad, who asks, how exactly did Trenchard go about trying to prevent the RAF becoming a reality or try to stifle it after birth? Did he take any specific actions in this regard?
He didn't take specific actions against the RAF, except from his resignation as the Chief of Air Staff, which threw the RAF into turmoil. In one stroke, it had lost its defining leader, which was problematic for a new air service. But in terms of what he did, he just argued against it. He sent private letters to John Salmond and to other officers arguing that it was a despicable decision, a deplorable idea, and that he wished that it wasn't happening. After the RAF was created, and he had resigned Chief of Air Staff, Trenchard was left without a job and sort of wandered aimlessly around London. And apparently, whether or not this story is true, he was on a bench in a park when he heard officers talking about how stupid he had been and that he was a coward, and that eventually got him to sign back on with the RAF and take over the role as the head of the Independent Air Service. And after the war, he did nothing to stifle the RAF. He actually saved it. Trenchard, by 1919, seems to be a completely different man when it came to the RAF, and he would go on to secure it in some amazing ways.
Yes, excellent. Okay, I have to say, Trenchard's private letters are always intriguing. We have to read between the lines at various points with what he has to say. Excellent. Just for our audience, there is a poll. They can vote on who they thought laid the foundations of the RAF: David Henderson, Frederick Sykes, or Hugh Trenchard. And upsettingly, Sykes has only got one vote at the moment. So I mean, we've got to do something about that, because you mentioned that Sykes came in and he didn't do a lot. He was upset by all these resignations. One of which was Henderson getting away from air intrigue.
Yes,
by resigning. Which I've always found interesting, the way that Trenchard goes, Henderson goes at this pivotal point. To what extent do you feel they're trying to leave a Rothermere out, and they're rather sort of surprised by how it actually plays out? I mean, that whole period is just, it's politicking on a sort of mass scale within the Air Ministry.
It's very interesting, and it's very clearly politics. It's all it is. After 1912. After 1914, when Henderson comes back to the Royal Flying Corps after being in charge of an army division, he seems to have a lot of distrust for Sykes. He seems to dislike the man quite intensely. There was a belief that he was after his job, which, as I said in my lecture, arguably does prove a bit true. Sykes did say on multiple occasions he was offered the job of the RFC, but in private correspondence, Sykes seems to rile people up the wrong way. Kitchener didn't like him, Henderson didn't really like him, and he butted heads quite a lot with Trenchard. So Trenchard resigning when Sykes took over from the RAF isn't all that surprising, as that bit as I talked when he said he was the most vacant and indecisive officer, and that he believed Trenchard was a loud mouth, but betraying a permanently vacant mind. It's not entirely surprising that Trenchard wouldn't want to work under him. But Henderson and Rothermere leaving, it's to what extent do I think Henderson's was political? I think there was some of it there that he didn't want to work with Sykes, but it was also at this point that Henderson had lost his eldest son in the war. He was ill constantly during the war. He'd just fought massively for an independent RAF. I'm sort of under the impression that Henderson just sort of had enough at this point. He was burned out. And I think much the same for Rothermere, which is a shame, because these massive resignations during this period absolutely could have spelled the end for the RAF. It just was lucky it didn't.
Yeah, I think the question I want to ask is, to what extent should we criticise Henderson for allowing that rivalry between Trenchard, or at least on Trenchard's side, at Sykes? I think it's debatable early on how much Sykes has a rivalry with Trenchard. I think he's just a bit aloof and dismissive of him early on. It's only later where they really seem to mutually despise each other. But to what extent should we criticise Henderson for allowing that to fester to what was clearly the detriment of the RFC, or at least it seems to be? And what does that tell us about his leadership more generally?
Henderson's leadership in terms of getting the RFC off the ground was amazing, but his leadership in terms of his two main officers, Trenchard and Sykes, can be called into question. He did left this policy of butting heads and infighting fester for far too long. I think one of them could just be personal. Obviously, Sykes and Henderson later had a falling out, and he probably quite enjoyed that Trenchard didn't like him, just personally, which, is a massive shame when it comes to military operations, when the three heads of an organisation massively dislike and distrust each other. It's not something that you need in the period of war. So Henderson can absolutely be criticised for allowing his two main officers to continue to butt heads in a way that would at some point nearly spell the end of the RAF when it was formed. But yet again, I don't. There's also the opposing argument, which is, what could he really have done? Sort of sit them down and go, "No, be friends, please," or move them about move them about. They were arguably two of the best officers, and the positions that they were in reflected that. So it was natural that they would butt heads quite a lot during the war. And barring sitting them down and saying, "Pack it in," there's nothing really much Henderson could do to stop that.
Yeah, I personally, I think it calls into question the whole story that there's this big rivalry vote. That there's these two really prominent figures, and then Henderson's allowing this really contagious rivalry to go on. It almost seems that it's very retrospective, this narrative backwards. That's what I'm going to say. But I'm going to.
It was in to jump on that point. It is retrospective because it is in Sykes's autobiography, and Trenchard's autobiography, which wasn't written by him. It was dictated. It does play a part in those two works. How far this was in the actual conflict, how far that rivalry existed, debatable. But Trenchard did resign and then leave the RAF, and then Henderson does leave after Sykes takes over. So there probably was a bit of rivalry. It might have been blown out of proportion simply in the books later on to sell copies and to make something seem more interesting than it actually was.
Well, I think by the time they write their books, they do hate each other. There's no doubt. I think they clearly detest one another. It's interesting to see.
Are they next to each other in the RAF church? Aren't there pews next to each other? I'm sure they are.
Forevermore. Okay, so we've got a question from Alex Revel, who asks about the September 1912 manoeuvres, and he's mentioned. Was the September 1912 manoeuvres mentioned when the validity of the use of aeroplanes for reconnaissance was made? He also asked, did I miss that Sykes was to be the first commanding officer of the RFC in France, but this was overruled because it was considered he was not superior enough in rank, which is why I went to Henderson. And I think that is correct, but it was later on.
Yes. That Sykes does take over from the RFC in France when Henderson goes on to command an army regiment during the First World War, but it's only for a month. Kitchener reversed that appointment. Arguably, one of the reasons Kitchener reversed that appointment is because Sykes is secondary to Trenchard in superiority, but also because Kitchener and Henderson do have that rapport that they built during the Boer War. So Kitchener got along far better with Henderson. And first part of the question, talking about the 1912 manoeuvres, they were used during the setup for the RFC, and because I believe that the side with aviation beat the other side, if I'm not wrong. But I must admit, I think I took that out of my original dissertation, so because I didn't have that many notes on it, so it just warrants more research. You're probably something you can tell me more about, actually.
Grierson defeats Haig. Is that right? I've got the book. Yeah, I can't.
I think Grierson defeats it.
Yeah, I think that's one of
the first point. I think it's one of the first reasons that Haig, a man who is quite hated in modern times, The Lions Led by Donkey's book, did a lot to ruin Haig's reputation. But during the First World War, Haig would go on to become one of Britain's foremost ideas on technology helping in war. He very much supported the Royal Flying Corps when it was under Trenchard. Him and Trenchard had quite a good rapport during the war. I didn't talk about it during my lecture because I was wary of the time, and it didn't really have much to do with the formation of the RAF. But Trenchard and Haig did get along, and obviously Haig did support technology in warfare. Yeah, so it's probably one of the reasons that Haig quite liked the aviations.
Yeah, I think it's important to say for criticism of Haig being anti-aviation pre the First World War, I think it'd be overblown. Sykes does say it in his book, but I think it's not particularly trustworthy, that reference. And he says something similar to Branca, but it's in India at a time when he's really keen that officers don't get distracted by such pursuits as driving fast cars, and they should instead do things to develop their character. And I feel that it's possible he feels this is fitting in, which, given Branca's personality, is possible. But anyway, that's a separate issue. Don't want to, just got to stand up for Haig, just as I am for Sykes, because I feel it's a bit unfair. We've got a question from Matthew Dormand, who says, do you feel that the efforts of Trenchard to secure the RAF after 1919 is overlooked or ignored when you make the argument for him not being the father of the RAF?
Trenchard's work after the First World War was over is vital in securing the RAF. He would go on to help the RAF survive for quite a tumultuous few years. After the war, the Navy and the Army yet again pounce back on and start thinking we can get our air services back if we just disband the RAF. The RAF isn't needed now. Unlike the Army and Navy, which were an important part of both the military and cultural side of Britain, the RAF doesn't really have that. The RAF doesn't have a peacetime role to fall back on. It doesn't have the culture, the history, the rapport with the people that the Navy and the Army do. And Trenchard, after the war, brilliantly links the RAF with the Empire. After the First World War, as many people would know, the British Empire was at its territorial height. It spanned from America to most of Africa, to India and across to China. And rebellions against the British rule were quite frequent. The seas were policed by the Navy and the land was policed by the Army. And Trenchard brilliantly realised that the RAF could be used to police the land far faster and far better than the Army could. And he used that during Kabul, and he used that against who would be regarded as the Mad Mahdi. The RAF was used during that conflict to bomb fortresses that the Dervish forces had taken over in Somaliland, and the RAF proved itself to be vital in securing the empire. They could move far faster than the Army. They weren't bogged down by bad roads. They weren't bogged down by bad communications. They could fly, drop bombs on rebellious forces and land again without a massive loss of life or massive loss of equipment. They were also far cheaper than the Army to use. In the war against the Dervish, the Army spent millions, and the RAF came in and did it for a fraction of the cost of what the Army were doing it for. But just because obviously it's a bit horrible just to talk about the bombing of rebellions, the RAF also was used in humanitarian aids during the Empire's in the Empire. The Kabul airlift comes to mind as one of the main ways that the RAF enamored itself with the British organisation. When Kabul was surrounded by forces, the RAF flew in from India across mountainous terrain and rescued every man, woman, and child from Kabul and flew them out safely without a single loss of life and without a single loss of aircraft. And it was publicised a lot in the Times and other British newspapers as sort of this massive, amazing operation, which it was. It's I think I'm right in saying one of the first major evacuations by air. I think in 1929 it happened. It was one of the first major evacuations by air. And yet again, so Trenchard's work with the Empire later on was amazing, but to say he's the father of the RAF because of his work in securing the RAF isn't exactly fair. Henderson created it. Trenchard just went on to secure it, arguably. Well, in my opinion.
To say, after resist the urge to dive into your description of the RAF and the Empire and its lack of reliance on roads, which I think is perhaps dangerous territory there. We've got another question from Alan Reed, so I'm thwarted from my desire to really get into that by to ask this one, which Alan's put: in the early months of 1918, the British High Command knew a major German offensive in the West was brewing. On that basis, was a major reorganisation of the Earth Service prudent?
Yes and no. On the one hand, it could be seen to be disruptive, as Trenchard does argue it would reduce efficiency and ruin it. But the independent air service that the RAF would become during 1918, it wasn't really a massive rework of aerial matters. The RFC in France was essentially untouched. As I said, it was just a stamp at the top of the document now read RAF rather than Royal Flying Corps. John Salmond and Trenchard really didn't see much of the change. It was only really in Britain with the air defence against the Gotha raids and Zeppelin raids that the British aerial matters were completely revolutionised. In France, the command knew that trying to change anything massively would, destroy the precarious balancing act that the Royal Flying Corps was currently partaking in. So it didn't actually change all that much in France. If the RAF came into being and France was completely changed and the command structure was completely redone, then I would agree that it would be a mistake to forge the RAF in the war, but it wasn't. So I don't think it was a massive misstep.
Yeah, I think that's fair. One of the questions I wanted to ask was on Henderson pre-war, and obviously his book, The Art of Reconnaissance, very important work, 1907, I think it's first published. He's clearly a massive advocate of reconnaissance itself. And that seems to be what, he recognizes that the aircraft is going to revolutionize this. He has, huge influence amongst other soldiers because of his previous reputation. He's not just this left field candidate coming in. He's part of the establishment. But how much does his vision of air power, how much is it predicated to a continental war? And what does that tell us about perhaps the British Army more generally? Because it doesn't seem that the RFC at any point is really thinking about dedicating resources to the Empire pre-war.
No, reconnaissance is a broad term, and obviously when talking about reconnaissance in his two works and later on, they can be applied to the Empire. Obviously, terrain changes vastly across the Empire, so being able to use aircraft to see certain terrain, find good points of ambushes, seeing where possible ambushes may be. It can be applied to that, but a lot of the reconnaissance is for a continental war, and I think that's intelligent on Henderson's part. He wasn't really looking to establish the Royal Flying Corps as a post-war force. He was just trying to look at getting British military aviation off the ground to begin with. And a continental war was brewing, and everyone knew it. Everyone in the Army High Command knew it. Everyone in politics essentially knew it. So focus on a continental war and bring attention to how France and Germany had these massive air services and these massive squadrons and these far superior aircraft, I think is quite smart on the one hand, because it brings into question why Britain's so lacking. With the reconnaissance as a continental force rather than an imperial force, I just think it's because the natural enemy of Britain in this future was going to be a continental power, and Henderson probably knew that. How far he knew that, I can't say. He doesn't actually say in his works. This is just educated guessing.
Now, I've almost tortured you enough, Brandon. So I think we'll make this the last question. And unfortunately, Johnny Dawes asked a really interesting question. I think it's a bit too big to finish on. So Johnny, I love the question. I think we're going to try and do something on that in the future. So watch this space. But I feel that, the poll's not doing well for sites. You've carried the day so far. So I'm going to have one last go at this. And that's to ask you to look at a hypothetical world. Let's do some counter history where the war goes into 1919. And a lot of what Henderson had pushed, how effective would that have been? And if it had gone into 1919, would we recognize him just automatically as the father of the RFC? Or would, and because I love Sykes, he's a great guy. Gets such a hard rep. I'm going to say, would it in fact be Sykes, which we see? Would he have more than one vote in this poll? And that's probably just because I've bored on enough. And there's still time for that one person to change their mind. Would we actually see the way he reorganized, he pushed towards strategic bombing? I mean, I think you mentioned somewhere, let's have a look. The only real damage done was to morale. But then, I mean, that had a huge effect in the time. There was a big worry in London about the effect of morale. So, I mean, if we had gone into 1919, we're looking at both strategic bombing and combined arms offensives using aircraft. Do we see Sykes in his position as Chief of the Air Staff, having reorganized the Air Ministry effectively, being the father of the RAF? Or do we see Henderson, despite the failure of engines such as the radials which were being developed, do we see him as still as the father? That's a question I'm going to end on for you.
Well, it's a great hypothetical. As I would still argue that in this hypothetical world in which the war went on until 1919 and Sykes was Chief of Air Staff for longer, I would still say Henderson is the father of the RAF. I think writing the 2 months report really secure that, and his work in the early years, and then much of his work in setting up the Independent Air Force really sort of carry the day for me in that regard. But I think if the war went 1919, Sykes would probably take over from Trenchard as the accepted figure of the father of the RAF. A lot of the work Sykes went on to do with the Independent Air Force, which was a bombing run, which was a bombing air force, and building the air force up, it was vital. And I think in this hypothetical, Sykes would probably be more regarded as the father of the RAF than Trenchard would be. Simply because after the war ended, Sykes had the horrible job of having to cut the RAF down massively from its squadrons. He lost dozens of squadrons in the cutbacks after the war because Britain was bankrupt, and the RAF was seen as the natural place to keep cutting money from. Sykes did, and it's something I didn't mention in my lecture because, yet again, cautious of the time. Sykes was vital in making sure the RAF survived those budget cuts. And in this hypothetically, he wouldn't have had to have done that as early as he did. It would have been delayed until 1920, sorry. So he probably would have been more affectionately known as the father of the RAF. But even in this hypothetical, I think writing the 2 Smuts reports and getting the RFC off the ground in 1912 really carry the day for David Henderson. I think he's as great as Sykes is, and I do respect what he did, and I do respect the man greatly for the work he did within the RAF. I think David Henderson has been quite unfairly relegated to the footnotes in those 2 men's stories. He's a footnote in Sykes' story, and he's a footnote in Trenchard's story. And even in this hypothetical world, I'd probably still be giving this lecture saying that Sykes wasn't the father of the RAF, it was actually David Henderson, although Sykes did quite a lot for it.
Good. Well, we like firmly held convictions, so we can disagree on that point. We'll pick that conversation up at a later date, I'm sure. But I've really enjoyed this, Brandon. It's been great to have you come in and speak to us. Best of luck in trying to get the PhD sorted. So yeah, I think all that's left for me to do is on behalf of our audience, and thank you very much to all of them for attending. But on behalf of our audience, thank you once again for giving this great lecture. So thank you very much, and everyone, goodbye.
Thank you.